Hey Ed, Hey Ed, can you hear me? And if you can, okay, great, thank you. Just for you that are on board already, it's going to start at 7 o'clock. Brief introduction for Bjorn, and then we'll get right to it. We ask that you keep your mic and video off when it starts, as Bjorn will control the screen and give us the presentation, and I will moderate the questions. And I'll try and be sharp and try and get as many questions in as I can at the appropriate time. I think that Bjorn will have set times for questions and whatnot. All right, and we'll see you in a few minutes.
Muted and your videos off. See, that's you. Okay. I guess.
Okay, everybody, it's 7 o'clock, and I see Bjorn is on the screen. Just want to do a quick intro. This is our fourth presentation from the PNBCA at no charge to the member clubs. This is the second time with Bjorn. He's going to take us on a journey tonight through the prep to go to the US Nationals in Rochester, New York, which he has just returned from, and what it takes to put your tree in a show, and how long it took him to do it. So there's lots of information. There'll be some Q&A, and we please ask you to keep your mics off and your video off, as Bjorn will control the screen while he's doing the presentation. Bjorn's website is Bjorn Bjornholm at bjornbjornholm.com. So if you want to look up his website and see what he has to offer, he does Bonsai-U now, which is a teaching program. You sign up for at a, I think, a nominal charge, but it's very good, nice and concise, lots of information. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Bjorn.
All right, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Did everybody else hear Bjorn?
Excellent, thumbs up. All right, cool. All right, first off, thank you guys for having me back for another presentation. So the video that I put together tonight, it's actually two videos, and these are recent releases from our Bonsai-U platform, kind of discussing display in general, going over a few displays from, for example, the Kokufu 10, the Taikon 10, and some other displays from around the world, kind of analyzing those. And then we're going to look at some of the trees that we actually took up to the US National this year in terms of how we selected stands for those trees, how we selected accent plants for those trees, and how we just kind of generally put together those displays. So the first video is about 45 minutes long. We're going to stop essentially halfway through it, do a Q&A, and then we'll get to the end of that video, do another Q&A, and then the second video is about 15 minutes long. So we'll watch that one and do a third Q&A at the very end of that. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and we will get started on the first video. Let me figure out how to do this here. All right, give me 1 second here, guys. It's for some reason not allowing me to share the screen. So give me just 1 second. Let's see. Okay, looks like we're good now. So let me make this full screen here and we'll start. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to a brand new episode of Bonsai-U. This time around, we're going to be talking about everything bonsai display. Now, in the next week or so here, we're going to be taking up a bunch of our trees here from Eisei-en, both client trees and some of my personal trees, to Rochester, New York, to put them on display at the US National Bonsai Exhibition. So I thought it'd be interesting to take some of those trees, set them up in the tokonoma here, and walk you through the process of selecting stands, selecting accent plants, and just building a proper display area. Now, as part of this episode, what I want to do at the very beginning here is actually look at some of the Japanese exhibitions, and specific the Kokufu 10, because that really is kind of the highest standard of exhibition anywhere in the world. And it's a good launching pad for kind of understanding display in general, and then building your own unique display from there. Now, it's not that you have to copy everything that's done in the Kokufu, but again, it's kind of a good baseline, kind of basic starting point for understanding bonsai display. We're also going to be taking a look at some photos from the Kokufu 10 in the past and analyzing how those displays were set up. And I'm going to pull in some photos from exhibitions from other parts of the world and discuss good points and bad points about those displays as well, so you guys have an understanding of not only what a good display is, but what a not so good display looks like too. And then at the very end, like I said, we're going to throw some of our own trees into the tokonoma here and figure out how to set the proper displays up. So first things first, though, let's take a look at the Kokufu 10, or the Japanese National Bonsai Exhibition. All right, so the reason I want to start with the Kokufu 10 here is, again, because it is the highest standard in bonsai exhibition anywhere in the world. It's sort of what, at least in my opinion, most of us around the world in the bonsai community strive for in terms of quality. Not only quality of the trees, but quality of the display set up. So in terms of how the Kokufu is actually put together, it's very basic. It's divided into three simple size categories. So you've got Shohin bonsai. Those are going to be trees that are up to about 20 centimeters in height, or 8 inches in height, measured from the top of the pot to the apex of the tree. A vast majority of those Shohin-sized trees at the Kokufu 10 are going to be displayed in 7-point displays. So we have a box on one side that holds 5 trees, and then we have a separate display off to the side called a hanedashi in Japanese, which has 2 points in it. And this is how you get a 7-point display. Sometimes you'll see the box displayed without a top shelf on it, so it becomes a 6-point display. Sometimes you'll see an L-shaped stand with only 2 elements and 1 other element off to the side, so it becomes a 3-point display. So there are variations that will appear at the Kokofu 10, but the standard for Shohin size trees at that show is a 7-point display. The second size category that you're going to run into at the Kokofu 10 are Chuhin size trees. These are medium sized plants. So typically plants in this category are going to range from about 35 centimeters up to about 50 centimeters max. So that's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 14 inches up to, we'll say, about 20 inches in height, somewhere in that range. So when you see Chuhin size trees displayed at the Kokofu 10, almost always they're displayed in a 3-point display, also called a santen kazari in Japanese. So the 3-point display would be your medium-sized tree on one stand, typically a taller stand. You'll have a Shohin-sized tree on the opposite side of the display space, and then you'll have an accent plant somewhere in the middle or in between those two elements, and that's what gives you a 3-point display. The final size category that you're going to see at the Kokofu 10 will be bonsai that fall into the Ogata size category or large bonsai category. So typically these are going to be trees that are absolutely minimum, say 60 centimeters or 2 feet tall, again, measured from the top of the pot to the top of the tree, up to about 90 centimeters, although sometimes you'll see trees that are a full meter, sometimes 1.20 meters, but that's very, very rare. So in terms of feet, that's going to be anywhere from basically 2 feet measured up to, let's say, 3.5 to 4 feet absolute max. The reason that there's a cap in terms of the size of the trees that can go in the Kokofu is because the museum where the trees are displayed is actually relatively small. So, typically the taller the tree, the wider the canopy, the deeper the canopy, the harder it is to fit on the display space or on the display table within the Tokyo Bijutsukan or the Tokyo Metropolitan Museum. So, when you're setting up a display for yourself, if you got a bonsai that's larger than that, that's totally fine as long as you've got the space to display it. But in any case, at the Kokofu 10 with the Ogata bonsai, they're almost always displayed. Actually, they're always 100% of the time displayed as 2-point displays with the larger bonsai and then an accent plant set off to the side. All right, so at the Kokofu 10, you're never going to see displays set up with scrolls or kakejiku hanging in the back. It's just not part of what's done at the Kokofu. You will, however, see scrolls on display with trees at the Taikon 10, for example, in Kyoto, which is an exhibition that's held in November every year. That's a bit more of a free-form exhibition, so you'll see a lot of scrolls, a lot of suiseki, for example, and other elements incorporated into the displays. For me personally, I actually like the Taikon 10 more than the Kokofu, just because it's more unique and more interesting. And we'll look at a few photos from that exhibition as well a little bit later in this tutorial. But again, I just want to focus on the Kokofu to start with here so you guys can understand the very, very basics to start with. So next up here, what I want to do is look at some of the photos from each of these size categories at the Kokofu 10 and explain how the displays are set up, how the accent plants were chosen, what are the elements that we're looking for in a good display. And again, we're going to pull in some photos from outside of Japan as well and kind of compare and contrast those. So to make this easier, we're going to do each individual size category to begin with here. So let's start out with Shohin size bonsai to begin with. All right, so let's take a look at this Shohin display first. This actually won the Kokofu show or the Kokofu award in recent years. So I thought it'd be good to start out with something that is kind of the top of the top in terms of quality here. So first and foremost, you'll notice that we do have the box stand off to the side here with our 5 trees in it. And then off to the left side here, this is our hanedashi with the 2 extra elements. So that gives us 7 points. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 here. So let's start at the top of the display stand first. This is usually the best place to begin when you're building a Shohin display. So the tree up at the top here really does need to be a very low profile tree, something with a lot of weight to it, but that's not very tall. So almost always it's going to be an informal upright tree with a very low rounded apex on it. Almost always it's going to be a Japanese black pine, which is a little bit strange because you're supposed to be thinking about the setup of the Shohin display here kind of as a mountain almost, where the highest element here is supposed to represent a high elevation tree, and then you're kind of working your way down. It's not always the case, but that's kind of the general guideline that we're supposed to follow here, at least at the Kokofu 10. Well, as you guys know, Japanese black pine is a coastal tree. So it's a little bit weird to have that at the top of the display stand here if you were really going to follow that high elevation mountainous tree, mountain setup kind of format here. But in any case, the Japanese black pine in an informal, upright, low profile style is almost always kind of the standard at the top of the display stand. Now, when you're setting up a display like this, we always want to start with this top tree up here because the directionality of this tree is going to dictate the overall directionality of the entire display. So with this tree up here at the top, it's moving downward towards the left. So that means that the overall display needs to move towards the left. So the box is going to be set up on the right-hand side of the display here. The box is going to stair step down towards the left, just like the directionality of the tree at the top here. And the bottom is going to stair step down in the same direction. And then of course, our hanedashi over here is going to be moving back in towards the right. So that creates a very nice sort of concise display throughout the entire setup here. Now, the next element that I would normally choose would be this one right here. So typically this tree is almost always going to be a semi-cascade tree, and it's typically going to be a relatively small plant as well that's set up on a slightly taller stand. So the reason that we want this to be a semi-cascade tree is because it's a very directional style of tree. And having it in this location really helps indicate that this overall display is moving downward and towards the left. And it really sort of forces your eye back in towards the middle of the display, which is the goal. Again, this needs to be like one giant sort of concise display here that all flows inward towards the center. Now, the next tree that we typically choose will be this guy right here. And this element, it can either go backwards towards the right in this case, towards this tree, or you could put something in here that actually moves downward towards the left as well, towards the center. Either way is fine. The more common approach, though, is this kind of setup where these two elements flow in towards one another. It just kind of ties it together within the box a little bit better, and it looks slightly nicer in my opinion. Now, one thing to consider here is that this element right here, this element right here, and typically this one down here are the three smallest elements within the setup. We're dealing with shohin size trees here, but that doesn't mean that every single one of them needs to be the same size. As a matter of fact, if they are the same size, it looks overly powerful and overly heavy, and there's not enough negative space within the display stand. So you'll notice here with particularly this element right here being so small, there's a lot of negative space above this tree. This is what we want. This is something that I see quite often at like the US National, for example. People will try to fill this space with a really large tree, and then it just looks overpowering here. Embrace the negative space. Think of AC/DC when you're creating a bonsai display like this. There's a lot of negative space in their music, a lot of pauses in their music, and they fully embrace that. And that's what makes their music so cool, I think. That negative space is going to add an element of openness to the display that's going to make it feel more open and airy and have better flow to it. Now, the next element that we typically display is going to be this one down here. This tends to be one of the larger trees that we put in the display box. And you can see here that this kinzu right here, or dwarf kumquat, is actually the largest tree, I believe, in the entire display. It really fills up that entire area. There's not a lot of negative space above it, which is totally fine. But the tree next to it here, again, is a relatively small one with negative space here. So that allows us to kind of have, again, the flow towards the middle, openness here so it doesn't feel so jammed and tight and compact within the display stand, and again provides that directionality that we're looking for. Now, the final tree down here that was chosen is a chojibai in sort of a clump style, and that's very, very typical. So in this area, you'll definitely typically see kind of a clump style tree. Opposite of that, in this area, you'll usually see something that is a bit more upright like this, almost like an exclamation point here. It's like a weight in that bottom right section of the stand that you sort of adds visual weight there so your eye doesn't move outside of the stand in the wrong direction. It doesn't necessarily have to be super directional back towards the interior here either, but it needs to be something weighty and heavy down in that bottom area to kind of hold the overall sort of display together and kind of ground it to the table beneath. So quite often in this location down here, you're going to see like a formal upright tree, perhaps a little cryptomeria, for example, a little hinoki cypress, maybe even a zelkova in the broom style with a very straight trunk on it. Those are all things that you'll typically see down in this bottom section of the display stand. Now, off to the side here on our hanedashi, almost always this is going to be a semi-cascade or a cascade style tree, because again, just like this element here that's very directional, we need something over here that's very directional, moving back towards the center of the display stand. So, semi-cascade, full cascade, those are going to give you that really heavy dramatic directionality within the display. Now, one thing to consider is that the height of this stand right here should never be the same height as the shelf within the stand. Quite often you'll see, tall root stands and they'll be almost exactly the same height and it looks a little bit weird. You need that variation here. So it could either be slightly taller than this shelf or slightly shorter. Most of the time it's going to be shorter, just because it's difficult to find something that's stable, that's that tall. And sometimes it looks a little bit weird to have it that big. Unless it's like a full cascade that's really cascading back down, I would put it on a slightly shorter stand like what has been done here. And then of course you've got the little accent plant here. Now, one thing that I've seen in the past in many exhibitions around the world is that all of the elements look great and then the accent plant ruins the entire display because it's overly large. It's almost as big as the shohin trees within the display. So you want to create and find the smallest accent plant that you could possibly find and make sure that the leaf size on this is very, very small. It needs to be as small or smaller than all of the elements within the display in terms of the leaf size. So we've got, looks like a gardenia right here, maybe a premna here perhaps. The chojibai, even the 2 pines have relatively small needles on them. So we want to make sure that we have a leaf size on the accent plant that is incredibly small. Now, I also want you guys to take note of within the display here, every single tree has its own separate display stand. So at the top here, we've got kind of a flat carved root stand, which is really cool for the black pine. We want to make sure, again, that whatever stand we're using up here at the top, it doesn't lift the tree too high on the top of the stand. Again, we want that low profile here. The reason we want that low profile is because just like when you're building a bonsai and you're creating an apex on the bonsai, if the apex is too tall, it'll have kind of a stretched neck appearance to it, and it'll look unbalanced, it'll look young, it won't look very powerful. Same thing is true when you're building a shohin display like this as well. That top element needs to be low, it needs to have that low profile so it doesn't feel like it's going to fall over, like the whole thing might topple over. So having this on a very low stand like this is great. You could even put this on a completely flat jita or a slab essentially, but it looks like they have a nice kind of maybe half-inch thick, 1 centimeter, 2 centimeter thick max sort of carved stand up here at the top, which is totally fine. Now you look down through here, each of these stands is different, although this one at the very bottom here and this one at the very top are pretty similar to one another, which isn't necessarily ideal. We want every element within the display to be different, not only the species, not only the pots, not only the sizes of the trees, but also the stands that they're placed on. So it would have been better if we could have come up with something just slightly different between these two. But in any case, the rest of the stands are very different from one another. This looks like 2 pieces of wood set side by side here. This is a nice tall, probably single piece of wood. Perhaps it's carved out, or in any case, it's at least a very nice sort of rounded leg at the very side here, which is nice. Down at the bottom, we've got a standard jita, and then off to the side, we've got the root stand here. So, it's pretty obvious to me that this is a fantastic display. That's why it won the Kokufu Award, that and politics, but we can get into that at another point in time. But in any case, it is a very well set up display, I think deserving of the Kokufu Award. All right, now let's take a look at a shohin display that was set up in the United States in recent years and kind of analyze it. Now, the point of this is not to crap on these displays. This is all meant to sort of elevate the quality and understanding of display in the United States. So we're just going to analyze, the good points and the bad points of this and discuss, how we can perhaps fix some of these things going forward to make it a better overall setup. Now, what I want to say here with this particular display is that this is actually very reminiscent of displays that you would see at the Kokufu very early on, like in old Kokufu books, like, maybe in the first, second, third Kokufu, really up through, I would say, probably the 1960s or so until things started shifting a little bit. So, this is a good kind of base to start from, which is great. A lot of the trees within this display have incredible potential to be really good trees in the long run if they're developed properly. And then, they could end up looking like a modern Japanese bonsai display at the Kokufu tent, like the one we just looked at. So it's not that, this whole thing needs to be taken apart and trees need to be thrown out and totally started over again. The base material here is great as long as things are developed properly and then the display is kind of reassessed in terms of how it's set up in the future. So first things first, again, let's start at the top of the display here. So we've got the Japanese black pine. It's moving to the right in this case, which is great. They've set up the display stand with the stair stepping down towards the right as well. They've got the hanedashi over here moving back in towards the left. So all of those basic elements are there, which is fantastic. Now with this tree up at the top here though, you'll notice that it is a very, very tall tree on the top of a very, very tall stand. You can see that the stand itself is actually taller than it is wide, which adds to the feeling that it has that stretched neck appearance to it, that it might actually topple over a little bit. It's just not grounded and stable looking. So having a tall stand like this that's taller than it is wide, having this tall tree on the top at the same time is not ideal. So in the future, it'd be better if this individual could get a shorter stand that's a little bit wider, and then take this tree and perhaps try to bring the apex down a little bit more on the plant, maybe even put it in a slightly shallower but wider pot would help a little bit as well. That'll drop the profile down. And then the stand that's up here at the top too, they could put that on a flat jita or a burl, for example, and lower the profile just a little bit more. So it wouldn't take much at the top of the display here to really drop that profile and make it feel much more weighty and stable. Now, if we move a little bit further down into the display, let's look at this element right here. So I can't tell exactly what this species is. It looks like it might be an Elaeagnus, so a silverberry perhaps. But in any case, it is not a semi-cascade or a cascade tree, which is fine, but it is pretty directional. It has a pretty obvious secondary trunk here next to the main trunk. So it's very obviously moving to the right, which is great. It's a relatively large tree for this area here, which is not really that big a deal. We don't really need a ton of negative space above this particular plant. So this element's actually quite good in this area, I think. The pot looks like maybe a modern Chinese pot, not really that big a deal. I think a lot of these are probably modern Chinese pots, but you can see that this is different than any other pot in the display, which is great. This pot here and this pot here both have the band through the middle, so it's somewhat similar, which isn't ideal. But in terms of the rest of the pots, they're different size and different color as well, which is great. Now over here, they've got a lot of negative space above this tree, which is fantastic too. This tree is pretty underdeveloped though for a display or for an exhibition. So in the future, as this develops out, if they could perhaps grow something that's a little bit more directional off to the side here, that may be a little too tall. Let's drop that profile down slightly more. Something along those lines, so it moves more directionally back towards the center of the display. That would tie in a little bit better with these two. Now, you'll notice in me drawing this line out that puts these branches very close to one another right here in the center. There's not really much negative space. This is also why you want to have a lower profile stand that's much wider. That's going to give you more negative space in between each tree. It makes the whole setup process much easier when you're choosing trees and putting them in the box display. So it looks like down here in the very bottom left corner, we've got a shinpaku, which is nice, but it doesn't really have the weight that I would want for a tree in this area. Again, finding something with a little bit more of a straight trunk is going to give you that sort of center of gravity right there in the very bottom and kind of stabilize the overall display. But in terms of the size of this plant, it's a little small as well. It could have been slightly taller, kind of up into this area to really fill that space. And I think it would have added some weight to that area too. The last tree within the box here, I'm not exactly sure what that is. Maybe it's a chojibai, perhaps. Quite a small tree. You'll notice that this particular tree is actually moving to the right here outside of the box. That's not a problem. That's totally fine. So just like this element above it, it can go either direction. That's not really a problem. Same thing with the bottom element down here. It can move to the interior towards this tree, or it can move to the exterior towards our hanedashi off to the side here. Now, this tree on the side here is sort of, I guess you could call it possibly a semi-cascade, which is kind of cool. It's a little bit interesting with the line here. It doesn't really dip below the edge of the pot, but it is quite directional, very low profile on a very, very tall stand. And you can see here, they did a good job of making sure that the height of this was taller than the height of the shelf within the stand, which is great. The trouble here is that, within a showing display, like I said before, you want to have a mix of different sizes of trees. But the size variation between this plant here and our top tree here is so disparate that this tree just swallows up this tree here. So if I had to say, one element that I would switch out of this entire display to make it all better would be the guy at the top here. I would make this a much, much smaller tree, perhaps something in this neighborhood in terms of height. And then this would actually look like a pretty well-balanced shohin display, just slightly underdeveloped again with a few of the trees. But this is really kind of the tree that's, I think, distracting and detracting from the overall quality of this display. But again, it's a good starting point here. They've got a variation in stand shapes, stand sizes, trees, species, pots, all of that. So they're moving in the right direction. It's just a few elements here and there that could be adjusted to make this display slightly better.
Okay, so we'll stop it right there. That gets us through the Shohin section. Next up, we'll talk about Chuhin and then large bonsai as well. But we'll go ahead and do kind of a Q&A right here. So if Ray wants to moderate for me, and if you guys have any questions, feel free to let me know.
No questions yet, believe it or not. I hope everybody realizes there's a chat function on the bottom of your screen, that's where you send in the questions on the chat function. And hopefully there'll be somebody asking about that. I like that you put in there the directionality and the sizes.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of times I don't know whether here where we have as great a show, of course, as the Kokufu or Taikon 10 or whatever, but I'd like to know, like I noticed there's a lot of different species. In that last one, there was quite a few deciduous trees, very similar size, like
Right.
no direction.
Right. Yeah. That's one thing I should have mentioned for sure is that, when you're selecting species for a Shohin display like that, putting together a 7-point display is actually one of the most difficult things to do when it comes to actually building a display out. It's much more difficult than a Chuhin or a large display. And the reason being is that every element needs to be different. And that also includes the species within the display. You don't want to have, all of your deciduous trees be flowering trees. You want to have a flowering tree, and you want to have a tree that has some sort of fruit to it, maybe a gardenia, for example, and maybe a tree that has a potential for fall color, like a maple. But you don't want to have, 3 elements with flowers, or even 2 elements with flowers, or 2 elements with berries, unless they're very, very different in terms of the shape and size and color of the berries. So each of those elements has to be different. And when you're building a Shohin display like that, you need to have at least twice as many trees as are going to eventually go into that display to select from. Because inevitably, leading up to an exhibition, one of those trees that you had wanted to put in the 7-point display is going to become unhealthy, for example, or maybe it drops its fruits and you need something else to fill that space. You need to have at least twice as many trees so that you can switch them out and move them into the right position when it comes time for an exhibition. So for those of you guys who are out there who are interested in working with Shohin trees, it's a very ambitious thing to do. So
well, we have a few questions now. Lanny says, hi, what would be the overall height of that first display?
The first display, it's hard for me to judge. The photo that I had, it did not have the actual measurement of the display itself, but you can kind of judge most of those Shohin trees. Like I said, max are going to be, absolute max 20 centimeters, so 8 inches from the top of the pot to the top of the tree. So from there, you can kind of deduce, the overall size of the display. You've got 3 layers there. So each of those 3 trees that are on, the layer, each of those layers are going to be, 8 inches. So it's going to be at least 24 inches there, plus the size of the stand and the negative space that you have in between. So, I would guess that more than likely the stand itself is probably going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of probably close to 24 inches by maybe 30 inches across, perhaps. So, and I mentioned before that typically you want to have a little bit wider stand and a little bit shorter, but sometimes these stands will be almost exactly the same width as they are height. Sometimes they'll be just slightly taller than they are wide, depending on the trees that the person who is putting it in the show. They'll source a stand that's going to match the trees perfectly. So that's another element that makes Shohin display very, very difficult. But in Japan, you can go to any number of nurseries or any number of stand makers, and they'll have a plethora of stands to choose from, different sizes, different colors, different features and details that then you can build out your display with. So it's much more convenient there than it would be in the States to build a display like that.
Okay, and Don asks, what's the point of having all the pots different?
So the goal is, to make it as interesting as possible visually. So when you have any element that's similar to another element within a Shohin display, Shohin display is not very big, and bonsai displays in general are not very big. So if you have elements that are similar or the same within a display like that, it becomes visually boring very quickly. And also, with Shohin trees, typically the pots that we use, particularly for deciduous Shohin trees, tend to be very loud pots. So say, for example, you had two yellow pots within a display like that, those are going to be visually overpowering and distract the viewer from, the overall presentation and the balance within the display.
Okay, and Lucas asks, how do you select accent plants? Would it be based on the plants found in the natural environment around your main display tree?
This is a very, very good question. I think I addressed this a little bit later in the video, but my short answer here is it doesn't need to be an accent plant that naturally occurs in the same area where the bonsai would naturally occur. If you were to go out, say, in the mountains, you wouldn't necessarily need to find something that grows in that exact same area. That's one way to approach it. So if you wanted to do that, that's totally fine. But what you have to realize is that the person who's putting on the display and putting the display together has their own intentions behind what their goal is in terms of building the display out. And I think I addressed this a little bit later in this video. So if you can hold off on my answer for now, I'll clarify later in the video. So, and if I don't clarify properly, feel free to ask the question again and we can address it in more detail.
And Karen asks, could you comment on the backgrounds?
The backgrounds. I'm guessing you just mean the backgrounds in the photos that were there. So for the kokufu, typically the way that the kokufu works is the trees have to be prejudged about 2 weeks before the actual show happens. So all of the plants have to be taken up to the Green Club in Tokyo and set up on display there. And then a panel of judges, I believe it's 12 judges, will go around and actually score each display from 1 to 7, and then they tally those up. The ones with the higher scores get in the show, the ones with the lower scores get booted out of the show. And then a majority of the trees actually, I believe, get photographed at the Green Club right after prejudging, if I'm not mistaken. I typically would not go up for prejudging. We very rarely actually put trees in the kokufu from Fujikawa-san's nursery, and if we did, we'd get somebody else to transport them up there to the prejudging event. So, but I believe that those trees would have been photographed at the prejudging event. And in terms of how they photograph them there, typically, at least at the Taikon 10, I know for sure, they'll put out these typical photo studio setup where you've got a nice background that it's the same color below as it is above, and then they'll actually put a tatami mat down and then set the display up on that. So you get kind of the depth of field, I guess, with the photos, a simple sort of neutral background. In terms of the photo of the tree in the States, I believe that setup there was at a show out in California. So I'm not exactly sure where the exhibition actually took place and where that photo was taken within the exhibition hall, but I think it was just kind of wood paneling behind it there. So that wasn't a professional photo. That was just one that I was able to find, a good example of something in the United States that we could compare and contrast with.
Jessica, I think you touched on this. Jessica is asking, how important is it to have pots with contrasting colors in a box display? I think that was something you were hitting on there.
Yeah, but specifically with the contrasting colors, with the Shohin bonsai, like I said, with the deciduous material in particular, the pots can be very, very loud in terms of design, color, even textures sometimes as well. So it's not we're not necessarily selecting the pots because they contrast with one another, although sometimes that does happen. And sometimes they are selected specifically to contrast with one another. Sometimes we just select the pots because they're a different color than the other ones that are in there, and they happen to, maybe contrast one another, or maybe even elements within those pots complement other pots. So you may have, like, for example, a yellow pot that has maybe like purple flecks within the pot, and you may have a purple pot that has a different color fleck in it or a different color, accent within it. But the flecks of the purple and the yellow accent and complement the actual purple pots that you're using for another tree, but they're very contrasted in terms of the main colors that you're seeing there. So it's not that everything has to be completely brightly contrasted between each pot, but you do want variation in terms of the colors, the textures, the sizes, and the shapes of the pots as well.
Last question here, I think. Carol's asked, I think she's asking, it's a question actually. Second display seemed too narrow of negative space between box display and accent tree to right.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. It was sort of jammed together. The second display was there. As a matter of fact, the first display too, if you really look at it, it's actually very close together. So the box display off to the right in that case, and then the Hanedashi off to the left, the one that won the Kogofu, in the photo is very jammed together. That's partly because it's very difficult when you're photographing a Shohin display like that to actually spread everything out, because when these photos are taken and they're put in the photo album, there's a very specific size that each page has to be, and the trees need to fill that entire space in the picture. So they're set up slightly closer together. If you were to actually go to the Kokofu, the space is a little bit wider for each of those, so it's going to be spread out just a little bit more. So the second display from the United States that we looked at, you're absolutely right that they're very close together, but my guess is the display space that was given to that particular display in California, it wasn't wide enough for the person displaying it to actually spread it out. So this is one reason why, like even at the US National, for example, I'd like to see actually less trees in the show. A little bit higher quality, you're able to kind of weed out the stuff that's not good, but you're also able to give more space to each tree and each display space. So ideally you want a minimum of really 8 feet would be fantastic if you could have it. 6 feet would be okay, but a lot of those displays at the US National and some displays in all over the US, all over the world, you're only getting maybe 4 feet, maybe 5 feet if you're really, really lucky. So everything ends up looking really, really jammed together.
Okay, that's the last question, and back to you, Bjorn.
All right, let me share the screen again. Okay.
All right, next up, let's take a look at Chuhin display, or Santen Kazari in Japanese. Now, as I mentioned before, these are going to always be set up in a 3-point format. So you're going to have the larger Chuhin tree off to one side, you're going to have a Shohin tree on the other side, and then an accent plant somewhere in the middle. Now, when you're setting these displays up, you want to think in terms of scalene triangles. So when you're viewing the display from the front, obviously, typically the Chuhin tree is going to be the tallest tree. It's going to be up on a relatively tall stand. So that's going to be your highest point. Off to the far right side or left side, depending on the directionality of the Chuhin tree, you're going to have that Shohin tree coming back in towards the center. It's going to be your second point. And then the accent plant is going to be your third point in that scalene triangle. So it's going to be offset either slightly closer to the Chuhin tree or slightly closer to the Shohin tree. And what dictates that is the size of the accent plant. So the bigger the accent plant, the closer it should be to the Chuhin tree. The smaller it is, the more you can move it over towards the Shohin tree. But that would give you a scalene triangle when viewed from the front. Now, if you're taking a bird's eye view of the display space for Chuhin display, we also want to think in terms of scalene triangles when setting up the trees relative to the front or to the back of the display space. So with the Chuhin size tree, typically it's placed furthest back on the display space towards the rear. The Shohin tree is placed slightly further forward, typically splitting the center from front to back. And then the accent plant is usually placed closest to the front. And again, that's going to give you that scalene triangle. Now, sometimes we'll readjust these elements. Say, for example, if you have a Shohin tree that's slightly large and your Chuhin tree feels a little bit small, maybe you want to move that Chuhin tree closer to the front of the display and the Shohin tree further towards the rear. Or perhaps the accent plant is quite large. Maybe you want to put that furthest back. You put the Chuhin tree splitting the center from front to back and the Shohin tree closer to the front. You can mix and match and move these elements around to your liking to create balance. But again, the goal from the bird's eye view is to create a scalene triangle. Okay, so let's take a look at this Chuhin display at a recent Kokofu 10. This actually won the Kokofu prize at this show, so I thought it'd be a good one to go over with you guys. So of course, on the right-hand side here, we've got a Chuhin Shinpaku juniper. You notice that this tree is very, very full. This is what I like to see in exhibitions. It's something that, if a tree is going into the Kokofu 10, for example, it has to be a pretty full, well-developed tree. If it's overly sparse, it's not going to make it through the pre-judging process. And this is what has kind of influenced how I approach bonsai display. I want to put trees on display that are very, very full, that still have, some delineation within the pads, of course. So you'll notice here that it does still have some pads up through all of these areas here, which is great, but it's not necessarily overly refined. It's very, very full, looks somewhat naturalistic. So for me, this is kind of peak form for exhibition. Now, of course, this tree moves to the left here. Got a lot of directionality to it. We've got our first directional branch here that's indicating that as well. There's a lot of lean to the tree too. So it moves much towards the center of the display, which is great. And then you'll notice off to the left side here, we've got a chojubai. Now, at first glance, this tree feels like it's actually moving to the outside of the display, which technically it kind of is. But one thing I want you guys to notice here is that because this tree is really directional here, is a lot of lean to the trunk kind of moving in this direction here. Having this tree actually move a little bit towards the outside here adds a little bit of additional negative space on this side, which is actually okay in this regard. Again, because we've got a very directional tree over here. If this tree were a little bit more upright, for example, I wouldn't necessarily want to put a tree that seems to be moving towards the outside on this side of the display. I'd want this maybe to be flipped around the opposite direction so that this branch right here is actually over here moving in towards the center. But again, with a really directional main tree over here, this is okay because again, it sort of adds some negative space towards the center here. Now you'll also notice that the accent plant here is very small. It looks like possibly a Salaginella fern with a couple of other things kind of mixed in here. Really nice little blue pot, so it adds kind of an accent within the display stand here. I'm looking at the text below this. You guys can't see that, but I can see it here to see what pots these are planted in. So looks like the accent plant here is in a Tofukuji, which is very cool. It looks like the Chojubai off to the side here is in what seems to be a Taisho period container. And then it looks like the juniper here is in a Kowatari pot, so a pre-1800 pot, very, very old container. So you notice here that the depth of this is actually, it's pretty deep for the tree, but I think it actually works with this particular plant. Usually the depth of the pot needs to be about the diameter of the trunk above the nabari. This is slightly deeper than that is wide, but when you're dealing with very, very old containers like this, sometimes we'll put the trees in pots that are overly small or overly large for the tree just because the container is so awesome by itself. So for this tree, it works quite well. Now, one thing I want you to notice here is that the line on the underside of the pot here, that little feature there, is actually mimicked in the line of the stand. So this was a perfectly chosen stand, in my opinion, for this particular tree. It raises the tree up high enough. Again, we want the height of this to be kind of at or above the height of the shohin. Typically, you can make this slightly taller than this. Really, you just want to make sure that this and this aren't exactly the same height necessarily. But in any case, this raises the tree up, looks really nice here. The width of the stand here seems a little bit wide, perhaps, but because the top of this is so thin, it doesn't add much weight. Also, because the legs are relatively thin as well, it doesn't add too much weight, being a bit wide here at the very top. So it actually does work with the tree. So I want you guys to notice here that the placement of the accent plant for the photo is actually right smack dab in the middle between the two trees here. So it's not like there's more space on this side versus this side. It's basically right smack dab in the middle. That was probably done for the photo purposes. It's a little bit difficult to take photos of these trees with enough space to spread everything out. If you actually go to the show and see these in person, there's a little bit more space in each display area within the museum. So these elements are spread out a little bit more. And I would guess that in this case, the accent plant, it could go either way in terms of being slightly closer to this tree or slightly closer to this tree, because it's not overly large. It's not necessarily going to overpower this particular plant. So it could go a little bit more to the left, could go a little bit more to the right, and it wouldn't really matter too much. But this is kind of primo in terms of Chuhin display setup. So again, I wanted to show you what the best of the best is. And finally, the last category that we'll look at the Kokofu 10 is our Ogata bonsai, or large bonsai. And again, these are going to be displayed with one tree and one accent plant. So, when you're viewing these from the front, obviously you're going to have an accent plant that's going to be much smaller than the tree itself. Typically, we're going to want to have that accent plant be at or below the height of the stand. It's not always the case, but it's a good kind of starting point. And again, just like the medium-sized trees, when you view the display space from a top view, if the accent plant is relatively large, you could put it further towards the rear. If it's a little bit small, you can bring it more towards the front, from front to back. So that'll add some size to it, at least visually relative to the tree if need be. Now, one thing that I think a lot of people sort of overemphasize when it comes to setting up, a large display like this is that the accent plant has to be a species from the same general location where the plant species of the bonsai actually grows in nature. I don't think this is true at all. I think that, if you go to the Kokofu, for example, and the Taikon or anywhere in Japan, that is the last thing on people's minds in terms of, selecting plant species to kind of mix and match together. What most of the time we're looking to do is create kind of a naturalistic scene, if you will, kind of indicating the season. So seasonality is much more important than actual location of the plant material. So for example, typically what's done in Japanese display is sort of indicating the upcoming season, what's coming next. So for example, if we're in winter, maybe you want to display a Japanese black pine, but say the accent plant that you want to put next to it is something that flowers in like late winter going into early spring. So you're kind of indicating that the seasons are changing. Maybe you want to put like a flowering apricot, for example, that's going to be flowering sometime in February. So if the display is in February, you put, the black pine next to a flowering apricot, it's indicating that spring is kind of on the way. Or if you've got, say an okimono, which would be, or a tenpai, which would be like a bronze item that you want to display with it. Maybe you find a bronze bird like an uguisu, for example, in Japanese. It's a Japanese bush warbler. Maybe you want to display that okimono with the bonsai in winter, indicating that spring is coming, because uguisu start coming out and chirping and singing in the very late winter going into early spring. So it's more about seasonality in terms of Japanese display than it is about, finding plant species that grow in the same location. Now, another thing I would want you guys to maybe consider too is that, maybe you do want to, create a naturalistic scene and you're not necessarily worried about indicating the season per se, but maybe what you're looking to do is indicate like a general region or a general country. So for example, in the United States, we've got, say, the Rocky Mountain juniper, for example. Say it was collected out in Wyoming. Well, maybe you want to represent, the flora of not Wyoming, but the entire United States. So perhaps you find an accent plant that grows in the plains in the Midwest, for example. Or maybe you find, a bronze figurine of a bird that only exists on the East Coast. But the goal is to create kind of a naturalistic representation of the entire United States. That's totally fine too. So anytime you go to an exhibition and someone's whining and complaining that that accent plant doesn't grow in the same area as this tree, you give them the two-finger salute, because it doesn't really matter. It's what you're trying to express with your particular tree and that particular scene that you're trying to create. So when I go around and critique exhibitions around the world, I try to avoid critiquing that aspect of it. And if I am going to critique that, I try to make sure that I speak to the person who actually put the display together to understand their intentions. So definitely keep that in mind when you're looking at displays and setting up displays for yourself going forward. All right, so let's take a look at this Ogata, or large bonsai display. Again, this is another one that won the Kokofu Award in recent years. This is a very famous Shinpaku juniper here, very, very big tree. The trunk is massive on it. The pot is huge on the tree, like a bathtub, basically. You can see that it's on a very low profile stand as well. This is very typical. The bigger the tree, the shorter the stand should be. There's no reason to put a massive tree up on a tall stand. Although for someone like me, I'm 2 meters tall, 6'6". I actually prefer them to be on a little bit taller stand, but that's just personal preference. But in any case, in terms of the overall balance of the display, you want it to be on a relatively low profile stand. The heavier the tree, the thicker the legs on the stand should be, the more ornate the stand can be as well. Because with all of this ornate stuff that's going on underneath the pot here, directly beneath it, it doesn't really detract from the tree. It actually adds some physical and visible weight to the stand, which makes it feel like it's less likely to crumble under the weight of the tree. So this is all absolutely a-okay. Now, in terms of the width of the stand here relative to the canopy of the tree, want you guys to notice that, with all of these trees, they're placed right smack dab in the middle of the stand. The idea is to sort of elevate the tree, almost creating like a picture frame. So think of it, when you're actually framing a photo, you're not going to offset the photo within the frame to create balance. You're going to put it smack dab in the middle. The frame does exactly what its name suggests. It frames the picture. The stand basically needs to be treated the same way. It's framing the tree, it's elevating the tree, and you want to have it right smack dab in the center there. But in terms of the actual width of the canopy here relative to the width of the stand, you'll notice that the main branch here does protrude out beyond the side of the stand. That's totally fine. If this canopy were larger, say for example, somewhere in this range, not that they would ever want it to get that big, but if it were larger, it would still be okay to use a stand of this size, allowing the canopy to actually extend beyond the side of the stand on both sides. That's absolutely a-okay. This is particularly true when you're dealing with broadleaf evergreen and deciduous material, big broad canopies on those species, those particular trees. It's usually a good idea to have the width of the canopy be a little bit larger than the width of the stand. You don't want it to be overly large necessarily, but it's okay if it overhangs it a little bit. Same thing with the coniferous material as well. Now you'll notice here they've got a really bright accent plant. To me, this is a little bit distracting in this particular display. It kind of detracts from the tree just a little bit. The size of the leaves on this accent plant too are really, really large compared to the very fine foliage on the Shinpaku. And this particular Shinpaku, I don't know exactly where the trunk is from. It looks like it's probably Tohoku, which is northern Japan. And this foliage is incredibly fine Itoigawa foliage. So it's definitely grafted on here. But with it being such a fine foliage like this with such a large accent plant leaf off to the side, it looks a little bit strange in my opinion. It actually makes the tree look smaller than it is because these are such large leaves. Now, in terms of the accent plant size over here, not really that bad. It's a little bit tall relative to the height of the stand. Typically, again, we want this to be at or below the height of the stand. Not always the case, but I would prefer it if that were the case. So that could easily have been remedied by removing the stand, putting it on a flat jita here and dropping the height of this by a good solid probably inch, maybe 2 centimeters or so to bring that down, and then possibly selecting a different accent plant for it. But overall, those are the kind of things that I'm looking for when we're dealing with a really heavy duty, particularly coniferous piece of material with a massive trunk like this. In a big pot like this, we want a stand that's very weighty. Ornate is totally fine when you're dealing with, big, heavy, powerful trees if it adds some visual weight to the stand as well. All right, and lastly, let's take a look at a deciduous tree at the Kokufuten. This is an Iwashide, which is going to be a hornbeam. So this is a very, very famous tree. I don't think it won a prize necessarily at this particular Kokufuten, but it may have won prizes in the past. But in any case, absolutely spectacular tree, very naturalistic, incredibly refined, a lot of ramification within the plant. So this is peak form for the kokufu. Now, again, I want you guys to notice that on this particular tree, the width of the canopy is just slightly larger than the width of the stand. It's kind of hard to tell based on the angle that this was taken, but this branch here actually does come right up to the edge of the stand, and I think it overhangs it just a little bit. But again, you can't really tell in the photo. But in any case, that is absolutely a-okay for a large canopy tree like this, particularly a broadleaf evergreen or a deciduous tree. Makes perfect sense to have it slightly larger. Again, planted smack dab right in the middle of the stand here. This is a little bit shorter tree, smaller tree than the Shinpaku that we just looked at. So the height of the stand is significantly taller, which is great. It kind of brings the tree up a little bit. It's got a really low profile here too. So the lower the profile, the higher the stand can be. Again, it's very similar to dealing with the shohin trees, that tree at the very top of the box, making it a low profile tree because it's on a very tall stand. Same thing here, low profile tree, you can put it on a slightly taller stand here. Now, this particular stand has some ornate characteristics to it, kind of through here, and up underneath here. I actually think this works really well with this tree because it follows a lot of these really sort of crazy lines within the plant. So it really complements those lines, in my opinion, to have this underneath here. It's right on the edge of being a little bit too heavy for this tree, though, because of how thick these two areas are right here. If this tree were shown in full leaf, the stand would probably feel perfectly balanced with the tree. But as it sits right now, having those ornate elements just right on the edge of being too heavy, but it still works in my opinion. Now, in terms of the accent plant off to the side here, Fullus halogenella, which is great. I really like this particular species used as accent plants, particularly with deciduous trees. at different times of the year. To me, it's a little bit large here. It could be, maybe like 1/4 smaller, just a tiny bit smaller, and possibly even a little bit taller as well. I mean, you have a lot of leeway and a lot of room to work with in terms of the height of the stand being so tall. So it could have been smaller side to side and maybe just slightly taller. And it might have been a little bit less distracting from the tree. But overall, this is a fantastic display. One of my favorite trees in the world here in an amazing pot. I can't really tell from the text down here what the pot actually is, but I would imagine it's at least Taisho Watari, so early 1900s, basically, possibly even earlier than that. But in any case, an unbelievable display. All right, now I mentioned before that the Kogofu is kind of standardized with those 3 sizes in terms of display, but there are other exhibitions like the Taikon 10, for example, where you're going to see other elements incorporated into those, like suiseki, for example, or scrolls, or what are called tenpai or okimono, which are going to be like bronze figurines, for example, set off to the side. So I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at a display that's not necessarily from the Taikon 10, but was inspired by the Taikon 10. This is actually a display that was set up by Mario Comsta, who's a bonsai professional in Spain, originally from Poland. In my opinion, one of the best bonsai professionals in all of Europe. But this is at his location, at his nursery. It is a Scots pine, kind of a triple trunk Scots pine here, set up in a tokonoma with a scroll and a tenpai or okimono off to the side, which is that little boat down on the left side there. So, this is very similar to what you would see at the Taikon 10, but this is such a great photo and a great setup that I figured we'd feature this here as an example. So the main thing I want you guys to notice here with the scroll is that it's actually placed pretty much smack dab in the center of the tokonoma. That's not always the case. It doesn't have to be right in the middle. It can be slightly offset to one side. Typically, it's slightly offset towards the actual tree itself because, with the negative space available to us within a tokonoma like this, the negative space will actually be the indicator of the directionality. So you can have a lot of relatively heavy elements on one side of the display and a lot of negative space on the other side, and it will still indicate and look balanced that it's moving towards that particular direction. It's like when you're planting a tree in a pot, you slightly offset it to one side, leaving the negative space on the side of the directionality. It's the same concept here within the tokonoma when you're dealing with the scroll. Now, another thing I want you guys to notice here is that the scroll itself actually does have directionality to it as well. So you'll notice here, we've got the sun on the right side, we've got the waves on the left side that are moving towards the sun. So it's a well-balanced scroll. It could be displayed by itself, but with these elements that are here relative to the trees, I kind of want to explain why this works so well. So for example here, if this tree right here were actually placed on the opposite side, say it were moving, to the right like this, it were completely flipped around, I think that this scroll would actually look a little bit strange right here because there's a lot of weight with the sun right here, and the waves are kind of counterbalancing that. So, for example, as it's set up right now with the sun being on the same side as the tree, it's a lot of heavy elements over here. The waves are a little bit less heavy, but they're kind of balancing out. The negative space adds a lot of weight over on this side with a little okimono off to the side here. So to me, this actually feels, with this tree right here, with the sun right here coming down in this direction, that it's very directional, moving towards the left with just a little bit of counterbalance of those waves coming back to the right, again with the negative space, and this little guy over here balancing everything out. So again, if this tree were over here, flipped around, going the opposite direction, coming down this way, I feel like it would feel just a little bit strange to have the okimono off to the side over here in terms of the weight of the scroll. To me, that's what it looks like. Maybe you guys feel differently. But overall, I think this was a really, really well done, well set up display. The waves here kind of mimic the lines in the trunk here, which is great, and also provide a little bit of counterbalance to the tree too. So all of these elements put together here, I think, work absolutely perfectly.
All right. Okay. What kind of questions you guys got? See if we get Ray back on here. There we go.
Yeah, had to click myself back on.
Perfect. Okay.
So Rob Callahan says, with the large plant in the first display, you noted the stand may have been on the long side. The depth appeared to be too shallow for the pot too close to the front edge. I believe he's talking about the Chuhin one, the first Chuhin one.
Okay, yeah. So the Chuhin with the juniper, and
Yes.
the Kojibai off to the side there. So yeah, let me reread the question there. With the large plant in the first display, you know that the stem may have been on the long side. The depth appeared to be too shallow for the pot, too close to the front edge. Yeah, I'm a little bit confused as to exactly what you're referring to in that particular case. Um, the depth of the pot for the chojibai was probably a little bit shallow for it, but it was a very special pot that was used for that particular tree. So, like I mentioned with the kokofu in particular, when you're selecting pots, we have hundreds and hundreds of pots to choose from, but you may not find the perfect pot for the tree, but you may have an amazing pot with an incredible provenance and incredible history to it that you pair with a tree, even if it's not the perfect match for it. So this is one thing when we run our tours to Japan, my wife and I run tours to the kokofu, for example. One of the main questions that people ask is, why is this tiny pot used for this tree? Or why is this massive pot used for this tree? And it all has to do with the history and provenance of the pot. So I'm not exactly sure, what you're referring to 100% here. So maybe if you could clarify in the chat a little further down, that'd be great.
And then Jessica wants to know, does the color of the stand matter? And how do you go about selecting the color?
Great question. So in the next video we're going to watch, it's only about a 15-minute video, but we're going to go through a handful of trees that I took up to the US National Show just a couple of weeks ago. And I actually explained the differences in terms of selecting the color of the stand relative to certain colors and elements within the tree. So I will answer that question in the upcoming video here.
Okay, and then Lucas is asking, are trees required to have moss applied to the topsoil for the show, or is it more so optional?
It is not optional. They have to have moss from the edge of the pot to the base of the tree. Now, in terms of actually mossing a tree up, there are a few things to take into consideration. It's not just going out and grabbing the greenest moss you could find and slapping it on the soil surface. There's an art to actually applying the moss on the soil surface. So we're looking for, a number of different species, usually at least 3 or 4 different species of moss, different size patches, and also maybe possibly incorporating some lichen in there as well, and doing kind of patchwork across the soil surface. Doing it that way, gives a much more naturalistic look, of course. And also, one thing to consider is that when you're putting moss on a tree, as you get closer to the base of the tree, typically the bark of most of the trees that we work with is a lighter color than the soil. So as we get closer to the base of the tree, to the root system, the nabari of the tree, if we use a little bit lighter color moss around that area, maybe even add in some lichen here and there, it can actually create the illusion that the nabari is bigger than it is. So this is actually a subject that we covered in one of our Bonsai U episodes on our Bonsai U platform a few weeks back. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I definitely recommend that you sign up for that. And I actually take you through how to apply moss properly to the soil surface for an exhibition. But at the US National Show, the kokofu and the Taikon 10, it really is not optional. I don't know if it's like 100% a rule at the kokofu, but it's just kind of a generally accepted guideline that everybody follows. So every tree will have moss on the entire soil surface.
Okay, and then Frank wanted to know, in your accent plant pot, how many different plants are acceptable in the pot at one time?
Yeah, so in an accent plant pot, there are a couple of ways to approach it. You can use a single plant if it's something interesting. If it's an interesting kind of fern, for example, you may want to use just one single element, or you might want to incorporate multiple elements. Typically, you're going to see 3 species of plants within an accent plant pot if there are multiple elements in there. So there's this sort of way of building accent plants that essentially is represented. It's kind of an old way of putting things together in Japan, but it's heaven, man, and earth, basically. So you have a tall element, which kind of represents heaven in the accent plant pot. You have a medium height element, which represents, humankind. And then you have a low-lying element that represents earth. So this could be, a grass, for example, that's a little bit taller. You might have like a dwarf hosta, for example, that's a little bit shorter. And then you have moss that's covering the soil surface of the accent plant. So it's 3 different species within, one accent plant. But having the variation in height, it can really make it quite interesting and also add directionality to the accent plant as well. So, accent plant directionality is very important, just like when you're building, shohin display, chuhin display, with all of those elements kind of moving towards the middle. When you're building a ogata display, a large tree display with one tree and one accent plant, the directionality of the accent plant also matters. You want it moving back towards the center.
Okay, Mark has a question here. When is seasonality important in a display and when not? And also a second part of the question, is there a reason why moss covered soil is necessary?
Sure, yeah. So seasonality in a display is as important as you, as the person displaying it, want it to be. So it doesn't have to be something that's incorporated in every single display necessarily. In Japan, it's one of the main things that is expressed through display. But in my opinion, display is one of those things where kind of the sky is the limit in terms of expression and sort of thinking outside of the box, not only in how the displays are set up, but also in the elements that are used within the display and what you're trying to express through the display. So, seasonality doesn't necessarily have to be a part of the display at all if you don't want it to be. But my goal with this video today was just kind of to provide you with a very, very basic understanding of kind of the generalized principles that are utilized in Japanese display and why certain elements are displayed within a display or chosen for a display. And most of that revolves around expressing seasonality, and particularly upcoming seasonality. And then to answer your second question, is there a reason why moss-covered soil is necessary? It looks nicer than seeing the soil actually, on the soil surface there. It just looks cleaner. It looks more complete. One thing that was popular in the States for a while, a few years back, was placing moss in certain areas on the soil surface, but leaving some of the soil exposed, which can look very naturalistic and very interesting sometimes. But 9 times out of 10, it's not done properly, and it ends up looking like you just didn't have enough moss to finish covering the soil surface. So, if you ever go to, the Kokofu or any major exhibition, and you see these trees covered with beautiful lush moss in multiple species and done in a really, artistic way, it adds a whole nother element to the trees. It brightens everything up. It makes everything shine a little bit more.
And then the last question is, Robert wants to know, are there other acceptable items that can be displayed in lieu of accent plant or scroll?
Yeah, absolutely. So, suiseki is an option, and this is just in Japan, right? So suiseki would be an option. You can use, like in the States, for example, we could use, like, for example, in the next video that we're going to be watching here, I actually use deer antler as an accent plant. Or an element in the display. And the reason I do that is because the deer antler was collected in the same area as the tree by the same person who collected the tree. So I liked having sort of that concise look. So yeah, there are all sorts of different things you can add into the display. And again, I think that this is, in terms of American bonsai, if you will, this is a good sort of place to sort of branch out and think outside of the box and step outside of the typical Japanese model. So everything that we've been talking about so far, you don't need to copy any of that. You don't need to mimic any of that, other than trying to create balance within the display. So the elements that we've talked about in terms of directionality, weight, complementary elements of the stand versus the pot versus the tree, all of those things I would still take into consideration. But in terms of what you're trying to express with the display, absolutely use any number of different things that express what you're trying to get across through the display. I think that's totally fine.
Thanks, Bjorn. That's back to you.
Okay, cool. So this next video is only about 15 minutes long, but this is going to be several of the trees that we set up and took up to the national show, explaining stand choice, accent plant choice, and just overall setup. So this is just to kind of clarify the points that were made in the first video. So I will share my screen again. We'll go to full screen. Here we go.
All right, right, guys. So in part 2 of our series here on setting up bonsai display for exhibition, I want to actually set up a few of our displays that we're taking up to the US National Show, take you through the process of stand selection and accent selection so you can see kind of in real time what it's like to prep for a show. So the first tree I want to dive into here is this Rocky Mountain juniper. This is a tree that I styled up for the Bonsai Kunst Hamburg online demonstration about 1.5 years ago. So it's been basically 1.5 years since we first styled the tree, changing the position to actually getting it in exhibition. So it's a pretty quick turnaround. But in any case, it's a very directional tree. It's one that has a lot of movement moving to the left there, relatively heavy pot to kind of counterbalance that movement as well. And I've got 3 potential stands up here that I want to take a look at to show you guys, what it looks like when we mix and match with different characteristics within the stand itself. So first things first, we're going to start out with the stand on the far left there, and then we're going to move to the one in the middle and the one on the far right. We're going to look at, do the characteristics match? Are they contrasted too much? Do they complement one another? What about the color? What about the size? All of those things. So without further ado, let's start with that stand on the far left to begin with. All right, so this is our first potential option here. This is a stand that I actually purchased from Fujikawa-san in Japan, my oyakata, my teacher. When I left Japan and came back to the United States, we needed some nice stands here at the garden, and he had this one in the collection at the nursery for a number of years. So I purchased it from him, had him ship it to the United States. So in terms of this stand with this particular tree here, I think it works relatively well. I would consider this design to be kind of like cracked ice, I guess you might call this feature underneath here. So as we mentioned in part 1, the bigger and heavier the tree, the weightier it is, the more ornate you can make the stand. So the fact that this tree has a lot of directionality to it and a relatively heavy pot to kind of counterbalance that, putting it on a stand like this that has some detail down here at the base, I think actually works relatively well. It gives it a bit more visual power. If this cracked ice feature under here was not a part of the stand, say it would just completely open through the base here, this would feel way too heavy on the stand. The stand would feel like it's being crushed because the upper base here of the stand, the actual flat platform here, is quite thin. The legs are relatively thin as well. So removing this ornate feature here is going to make it feel like it's getting crushed by the tree. Now, in terms of the cracked ice feature here actually complementing the tree to some degree, I think it does. There's a lot of detail in terms of the striation within the deadwood, and those kind of interplay nicely with one another. Now, color-wise, I prefer typically darker colored stands, particularly when you're dealing with trees that have a lot of deadwood. It really makes them pop in the exhibition. So the fact that this is a darker color here does make that deadwood stand out relatively well. Width-wise, in terms of the width of the stand, I think it matches pretty well with the tree too. So, this is definitely a possibility in terms of stands that we might use for this tree at the US National Show. Okay, so here is option number 2. So first thing you'll notice on this stand that it's much narrower side to side than the last stand. However, the legs are a lot thicker than the previous stand. So when you're dealing with a tree that is a pretty heavy duty tree, you need to have at least some element within the stand that's going to support visually the weight of the tree. So having these large legs does that for us. And the thicker the legs, the thicker the features on the stand, the smaller the stand can be from side to side when you're selecting it for a tree. So size-wise to me, this actually isn't a bad choice. This is a very standard bonsai stand that you'll see at most exhibitions in Japan, including the Kokofu 10. This is another one that I purchased from Fujikawa-san and had him ship over because it's a really good kind of general purpose, general use stand. That being said, it's not very unique in terms of pairing it with this tree. It just looks very standard. So this stand is a little bit more of a sort of brownish red color, which still works with the juniper. We've got the live vein all cleaned up on the tree. It's a nice bright red color. So having a little bit of red in the stand makes that element of the tree pop a bit more than the deadwood, for example, with the darker stand, like we said before. Darker it is, the more the deadwood pops. The redder it is, the more the live vein pops. Now, again, we've got this line running across the front of the stand too that adds some visual weight to this stand. If that weren't here, the tree might feel like it's crushing the stand again. But this is a pretty good option, although I don't think it really necessarily brings out the most interesting features of the tree. It doesn't really complement the tree other than the color with the live vein. So let's test out stand number 3 and see if it's any better. All right, and here is option number 3 for this Rocky Mountain juniper. This stand is another one that I purchased from Fujikawa-san. I loved this stand my entire time in Japan, always admired it for the 9 years that I was there, and Fujikawa-san allowed me to purchase it from him when I came back to the States. So obviously this stand is relatively wide. It's somewhat similar to the first cracked ice stand in terms of its size, but of course it has different characteristics. So first and foremost, the reddish color actually, again, does draw out the color of the live vein. But the main thing I think that's actually complementary between the stand and the tree are these little upward kind of flips at the outer end of the upper platform there. They're very similar to some of the curvature in the deadwood, particularly in the tenjin at the top of the tree, and in some of the swirls of the deadwood within the trunk. I really think they complement each other nicely. Now, the fact that this is relatively wide, relative to the tree, is okay because the actual legs of the stand are further in towards the center, and they're actually essentially right on the outside edge of the pot. So it gives it a lot of sort of visual weight and stability, in my opinion, without making it feel overly heavy. And again, we've got sort of that upward theme right through here with these little ticks that kind of stick out within the front sort of ornate section of the stand here. And again, those complement the tree. So for me personally, out of these 3 stands, I feel like this one actually complements the majority of the features within the plant better than the other 2. So this is my vote for this one, but I'd love to hear your all's opinions. So feel free to send those to me via email, or we can chat about them in the chat as well. All right, now that we've got the stand chosen for the tree, it's time to pick an accent plant. So I've selected out 3 potential options here. We're going to set each one up individually and assess what it looks like with the tree. All right, so the first option here is this grass planted in a deep red pot. Now, this doesn't look bad with the tree, in my opinion. It feels maybe a little bit large for it. It kind of overpowers it to some degree, but the grass is spread out and fanned out enough that it might actually work. And if we were to take this and push it further towards the rear of the display area, again, the visual size of it. Now, you'll notice that the height of that grass is just a little bit taller than the stand here, which isn't necessarily ideal, but it's only a few pieces that are sticking up. So this is a definite possibility. Now, with a grass like this, it gives it a very sort of summer type feel. So, it gives it kind of a cool feel in the summer, like you can almost feel the breeze actually blowing through the grass, which does kind of sort of mimic the theme of the tree being a very windswept tree way up in the high elevation mountains, and the grass being down in the low elevations down below. It's like the tree's kind of overhanging the valley. So to me, in terms of creating a naturalistic scene, I actually think it works relatively well. But I don't know if this is going to be the best choice necessarily, so let's try out the other 2 options. All right, so option number 2 here is this pyrosia planted in a round sort of Namban style pot. Now, this accent plant is shorter than the last one, but it's about as wide. But being a pyrosia with large leaves like that, it actually feels very heavy, even though it's slightly smaller than the last one. So to me, this actually really detracts from the tree. And the shape of the leaves on that particular tree kind of mimic the shape of the branches on the plant. And I want something that's a bit more contrasted between the 2. So for me personally, it just feels like it doesn't match the bonsai very well. Okay, so our third option here is this crescent-shaped pot with a very small accent plant coming out of it. Now, in the overall display area here, this is our tokonoma here at Eisei-en. This is actually quite large. I believe it's, 9 or 10 feet long and a good 3 feet deep. So this accent plant actually looks a little bit small, I think, next to this tree here. But if you know where the tree is going to be displayed at the exhibition and how much space you have, that will sometimes dictate the best accent plant to choose for the tree. So I know for a fact that we're not going to have 9 or 10 feet of space to actually display this tree at the national show. It's going to be much more compacted. So this particular accent plant, even though it looks small here, will actually look in proportion with the tree and not overpowering within the actual display area once we take it up to Rochester. So in terms of the actual, accent setup there and how it looks with the plant stylistically, I really like the curvature of that with the curvature in the trunk and the deadwood of the tree and the curvature here mimicked in the stand. So all 3 elements sort of have that moon shape appearance to them. So they all complement each other quite nicely. So I like that. Now, with this particular accent plant here, it is in an unglazed pot. It does have a little bit of glazing on it. This obviously is an unglazed pot. So the ideal situation would be for that to be maybe a slightly brighter color, or maybe the glazing that runs through the unglazed pot could be a brighter color. But in any case, stylistically, out of the 3 accent plants, and just based on the size of the display space in Rochester, I actually think this is going to make the most sense for displaying with this particular tree. So you got to keep all of those elements in consideration when you're selecting an accent plant for a bonsai. Okay, next up is our giant Rocky Mountain juniper here. This is a tree that I'm most excited about taking up to the National, because it's one that I've worked from total raw material when it was collected, I think maybe 5 years ago by the backcountry guys, Dan and Steve. It was in a wooden box. The foliage mass was about 5 times what you see right now. And I've slowly worked it back, developed the ramification, and filled the tree in during that period. So really excited to take this up there. Now, for this particular tree, I don't really have a lot of stand options here at Eisei-en. So this is the one that we're kind of stuck with this time around. Now you'll notice that, stylistically it looks pretty good for the tree. Size-wise, it's pretty good, but it does feel maybe a little bit unstable for the plants, maybe not heavy enough to support such a large tree. It is actually stable in person, but visually it looks maybe just a little bit off. So ideally, if I had something that had a little bit thicker leg to it, maybe something with a little bit more ornate underside to it to add some visual weight to it, that might have been better for this particular tree. But even in a professional nursery, even though we've got dozens of stands here, sometimes we just don't have the right one for the tree at the right time. Now, I featured this tree in many videos in the past and in Bonsai U videos as well. And we've discussed a little bit about it being one of those ambiguous trees in terms of directionality. It could move either to the right or to the left. So I'm going to set this tree up with our chosen accent, which is going to be a deer antler on both sides so you guys can see what it looks like. And then I'd be curious to get feedback from you guys as to which side you like it on the best. All right, so option 1 here is to put the tree on the left with the directionality moving to the right. So to me, when I first look at this tree, that's kind of the directionality I see within the plant. But when you actually go and set it up at an exhibition or in a tokonoma like this, it can become quite ambiguous. So, with the negative space that we have down here with the main gin kind of running in this direction off to the right, I feel like it's moving this way. So if we place the deer antler on the right side here, moving back in towards the left, I think it's got a really nice kind of concise look to it. Now, the reason that I wanted to use this deer antler here, this is a white-tailed deer. This was actually collected about a mile from where this tree was collected out in Wyoming by the same guy who collected this tree. They sent this to me from backcountry. So I thought it'd be really cool to put them together. I think it's a pretty cool feature having them together. But in any case, let's flip this whole thing around, see what it looks like going the opposite direction. All right, so flipped around, going in the opposite direction, I actually think it works relatively well this way too. So we've got the original root here that's hanging off the side, so that's obviously very directional there. The movement up through the trunk loops back around on itself, and we do have a lot of foliage coming back in towards the interior here, which could technically be sort of like a directional branch on the tree. So having that sort of loop-de-loop moving this direction actually works relatively well. Now, the deer antler, it only has really one good front to it, so it's moving, outward away from this, but that sort of negative space there actually works relatively well in this case. So this might potentially work in this setup too. Now, my biggest concern is where is this going to be displayed within the exhibition up in Rochester? It needs to have enough space for all of these deadwood features to fit without extending into the neighboring display. So that may dictate which side we end up displaying the accent on relative to the tree. But in any case, I'd be really curious to hear what you guys think as to which direction this tree moves. Does it move to the right? Does it move to the left? Let me know what you think. All right, so this is the final display I want to show you guys that we're taking up to the US National. This is a 3-point display using shohin trees. I mentioned that typically at the Kokufu, you're going to see 7-point displays when you're building a shohin display out. That's an incredibly difficult thing to put together though, because as we mentioned, all of the elements have to be different. Species, pots, sizes, styles of trees, every element has to be different. So to put something like a true 7-point shohin display together is insanely difficult. You have to have at least twice as many trees in your collection as you need for that final display, because inevitably something's not going to fit right, something is going to look bad right before the show and need to be switched out. So, if you look at the Kokufu books and you look at those shohin displays, the 7-point displays typically represent the most expensive displays out of any of the displays set up at the Kokufu, just because every element is top quality, including the pots and the small stands too. But in this case, we're setting this up as a 3-point Santen Kazari using shohin trees. The tree on the right side here is a hornbeam in the neagari or exposed root style, kind of as a semi-cascade or cascade tree. So we put it on this tall L stand so it can cascade back down to the left. And then on the left-hand side here, we have a Chinese elm. Now, typically I would recommend having a conifer and a deciduous, or a conifer and a broadleaf evergreen, rather than having 2 deciduous trees like we have here. But you don't always have every single element that you need for a display. So as long as the species are different, which in this case, again, we've got an elm and a hornbeam, you're totally fine. Stylistically, the trees are completely different as well. So we've got kind of an informal upright tree on the left-hand side there. And again, we've got the cascade / semi-cascade on the right-hand side. So that's great. But one thing I want you guys to notice here with this display is that the tree on the left-hand side there, if it were set up by itself, it really feels like it's moving to the left, because the main directional branch is on the bottom left-hand side. The apex kind of extends towards the left as well. But when setting up this particular display here, the front of the hornbeam makes it move towards the left. So we need to have something on the left-hand side there that kind of comes back in towards the right. So if you do look at the overall setup here, even though that tree on the left-hand side kind of moves to the left, when we set it up in this way, it does still feel like it's kind of moving in towards the center. It's another one of those ambiguous trees, just like that last Rocky Mountain juniper that we looked at. So what I'm trying to say here is that just because a tree by itself looks like it may be going one direction, set up the whole display, see what it looks like tied in with the other elements in the display, and sometimes it works itself out properly. So I hope you guys enjoyed these 2 episodes here about setting up display. I hope that it kind of sort of added to your knowledge of exhibition prep and setting up things for exhibition. I know that there's a lot more information that we'll dive into in future episodes of Bonsai U, so I'm sure you guys still have a lot of questions. So feel free to submit those to me, and I'll try my best to clarify and to answer those going forward. So in any case, hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Look forward to seeing you all next time. Take care.
All right. That was the end of the video. So what other questions you guys got for me?
Okay, Robert was asking about, he was saying back when he asked you a question about that tree in the stand.
Yes.
Back to the earlier question, the relationship of the table plant pot front to back, there be reasonable space for the pot. It doesn't look like it would shift off the table of the display or bumped, or the table was too narrow.
Gotcha. So I'm guessing what he means is the tree on the stand, like front to back, I guess, if the stand is quite narrow front to back.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what you're getting? Yeah. It's hard to tell in that particular photo exactly how wide the stand is from front to back. Typically you want to have at least a little bit of space around the front side. One thing that I didn't mention in this video that I should have is that, just like when you have, 100 pots or 200 pots, you never have the right pot for the tree when you need it. Same thing is true for stands. So you could have a stand that's like 90% of the way there in terms of matching the tree, in terms of the size of the stand, but, maybe it's just like 10% too large. In that instance, what you would want to do is move the tree on the stand slightly closer to the front visually, because it'll make the stand feel slightly smaller. And vice versa, if the tree is too large for the stand, you move it slightly to the rear on the stand and add a little bit more negative space around the front side of the stand. That way it's going to make the stand appear slightly larger. So there are ways around that to some degree. But that particular Chuhin tree, it's really hard to tell the way that the photo was taken. If that stand was very narrow front to back, it may be that when they took the photo, they actually put the tree too far forward on the stand, and it made it look like it's narrower than it actually is. It's difficult to tell via the photo, though.
Don was wanting to ask, what was the accent plant in the last 3-point display?
Yeah, so that last one that we set up to take up to the national show, it's a little bean fern that you can get from Japan. Actually, if you go into the mountains anywhere in Japan and you look at, you go kind of into the woods in the mountains and you look at kind of sheer rock cliffs or rock faces, kind of in cool areas within the mountains, you'll see all of these little bean ferns kind of running up and down those rocks. So that was collected from one of those areas and then propagated and brought over to the US. So I'm sure it was one of those accent plants that magically teleported itself here from Japan. It wasn't one that I brought in, but the owner of the tree had it in their collection. So that's why we used it.
He was noting also, Robert was noting regarding the tree with the dead wood, one reads generally left to right, the top of the tree off to the right visually leads to empty space.
Yeah, so I'm guessing you're referring probably to the big Rocky, the big zigzag Rocky. So I ended up setting up the display with the tree moving to the right. So the first setup there. Overall, to me, it just feels like it's moving in that direction a little bit more. So I do agree with you that, the negative space sort of indicated by that gin sticking off to the right up above the foliage is more of the indicator of the directionality of that tree.
I guess, my thinking is that nature gave you that massive piece of deadwood there that looks lovely.
Yeah, show it off.
Colin wants to know what are the first stands to get for maximum versatility with varied bonsai collection?
Okay, so one of the best stands to get stylistically is the second stand that we used for that first Rocky Mountain juniper that was very directional. That stand is very, very standard. It's got the bar that just kind of runs underneath the base of it, very simple lines to the stand. And it's size-wise, it's one that can be used for medium size and for larger size trees as well. And I forget the exact dimensions on it. It's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of about 22 inches across, I believe, and about 8 inches tall. So somewhere in that range would be good. Very simple lines to that stand as well. And it's a very versatile, easy to use stand. If you wanted to have, multiple stands for various sizes of trees, you could easily have that same style of stand and just get slightly larger and slightly smaller versions of that so that you can mix and match depending on the size of the tree. But kind of that general range, like 22 inches, maybe 18 to 22 inches, somewhere in that range, would be a good general size to start with. One thing that I've noticed in the past in the States is that people tend to put their trees on very, very low profile stands. So quite wide, but not very tall. You need to think a little differently. You need to think of elevating the trees more. So always try to find stands that are slightly taller rather than buying very low lying stands. Unless of course you're working with massive trees only, then you'll need a little bit lower stand. But typically most people are working with medium size, maybe slightly larger than medium size. So, 6, 8 inch tall stands are really what you need to be looking for.
Ard is asking, the last 3-point display seemed a bit sparse. Could you group the 3 items a bit closer together, or are there strict rules to the spacing here?
Yeah, so I would not want to put those elements really any closer together. It's really hard when you're photographing or filming a display, whether it be a Shohin display or a large display with 2 elements, to get it to look balanced within the frame of the camera. In person, I actually would have spread that out a little bit more than what you saw in the frame because embracing that negative space is actually very important. It's one of those things that it takes a little bit of time to understand, proper spacing within a display. It's just like in any art, painting, sculpture, whatever it may be. Embracing the negative space, it's difficult at the beginning. You want to tend to jam things together a little bit too much. So I think if you were to see that in person and see it spread out a little bit more, it would make more sense. But you got to kind of factor in the fact that it was taken with a camera, and we have to kind of jam things together a little bit. So for me, it's a little bit of the opposite. I'd actually want to spread things out a little bit more.
Lucas says, more of a question about Japanese versus American display. What do you see as being the main differences between the two in terms of style/display choices?
Yeah, so, it depends on the exhibition, it depends on the situation and all of that. But if we're just taking like the standard sort of kokufu approach to display, it's very standardized and actually quite boring, to be honest. This is why I like the Taikon 10, for example, a bit more, because it's a bit more freeform there. In the United States, it's free form, but to the extreme end, on the other end of the spectrum. You know, the United States is a very individualistic society. People like to, you know, display their arts and you know, put it all out there. There's not a lot of subtlety necessarily in American art and American bonsai. And sometimes that can lead to things looking very, very braggadocious, I guess, sometimes kitsch as well, and not very well balanced, overly loud, overly in your face. So I think, you know, at the moment, there isn't an American style of display. There are some people that are way outside, you know, in left field that are a little bit too far out in that direction, and have gone so far in that direction that they've lost the sense of balance within the display, for example. So, you know, I think there are people who are too far in, on the other end of the spectrum, who are too Japanese in the way they do things. So bonsai is still relatively young in the United States. And I think over the next like 10, 20, 30 years, you'll start to see kind of a convergence, maybe more towards the middle, but it'll still be inherently American in terms of how things are displayed. So I'm actually really curious to see where it goes over the next 2, 3, 4 decades here.
Ard wants to know regarding in Japan, regarding your display with the horn, would you see that as radical in Japan, or was it?
Not necessarily. You know, so personally, I've never seen you know, a deer antler used in a display in Japan, but repurposing natural things and using them in display is something that's commonly done, or even repurposing things that are man-made, but using them in a different way. Like, for example, this isn't in bonsai specifically, but in gardening in Japan, you'll see millstones repurposed and used as stepping stones in a garden, for example. So repurposing things like that is quite common in Japan, but you know, using a deer antler, there aren't that many large trees as big as that Rocky Mountain juniper that I displayed there that would merit using something as large as an actual deer antler. As a matter of fact, I took up a tree to the National that we didn't feature in this video that was twice as big as that Rocky Mountain juniper, maybe 3 times as big. And instead of a deer antler, I used an elk antler next to that one. And as you know, elk antler is about 5 times the size of a white-tailed deer antler. So, you know, that would definitely be extreme in Japan, but I don't think it would be seen as radical in and of itself. It's just in terms of scale, I was able to do that with that particular tree.
Okay, Bjorn, that's the last question there.
Cool.
I don't have any myself for that one.
Okay, excellent.
Although I did like the stand, you know, the 3 stands you had originally, the one with the ice, and then the middle one, and then the last one.
Yes.
I was noticing that stand also with that curve actually matched the pot lip as well.
Exactly. Yeah, it had all that sort of moon shape elements in there.
Yeah, it was very nice.
Yeah. So that's kind of why we ended up going with that one. I mean, it actually in person it looked way better than in the video as well.
Can you talk about the size of your tokonoma that you have that you built there?
Yeah, so my tokonoma, I believe it's 10 feet by 3 feet, which is humongous. Normally, like the standard tokonoma would be the size of a tatami mat, which I believe is 90 centimeters by 30 centimeters, if I'm not mistaken. So it'd be 3 feet by 1 foot. Is that right? No, maybe 90 centimeters by 60 centimeters, so 2 feet. But in any case, significantly smaller. Quite often you'll see 2 tatami mat size tokonoma or 1.5 tatami mat size tokonoma, but I knew we were going to have large trees here, and I also knew it's much easier to have the extra space to take photos of trees against the white backdrop if we make it much bigger. So that's why I went with the 10 foot by 3 foot. But it's a little bit unconventional in terms of an actual true size for a tokonoma.
Oh, thank you. Ard says, awesome, thanks very much. One last minute question. Do stands have to be wood? I could imagine some nice raw steel stands.
Yeah, absolutely. They do not have to be wood. They can be any number of different elements. And this is something that a lot of people in the States have been experimenting with. And even in Japan, you'll see it on occasion. Use of steel or metal or other things that are sort of outside of the traditional norm that we would normally go with.
Well, that's the last question.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you guys very much for having me again. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. Thanks very much, Bjorn. Hopefully we, people that are listening, I hope you give us the feedback on these Zooms. We're trying to look at whether to continue or not in the future. With the COVIDs, maybe it will go away. Do we need Zoom again or not? Anyways, very interesting to hear. And also, and there's lots of thanks coming in here.
Cool.
From everybody. And it was a great show.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you guys very much. I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks, Bjorn.
Yep, take care.
Bye-bye now.